Now, before we get into talking about the problems that Thomson's argument faces, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the type of argument that she is in fact making. You may recall, or you may not recall from early in the semester when I was discussing the different types of arguments that exist. We talked about deductive arguments, we also talked about non-deductive arguments. And as I said back then, there are a host of different types of arguments. Well, one type of non-deductive argument, which is what Thomson is making, is called an argument by analogy. And there are a lot of words up here, but an argument by analogy is a type of argument in which you're comparing two things with one another. You're comparing, as I say up here, X and Y. You're comparing two things, and then based on that comparison, you draw an inference on the basis of it. We actually use argument by analogy all the time. You may have heard people say things like, well, you have to compare apples to apples. You can't compare apples to oranges. Well, when you say something like that, hey, you have to compare apples to apples, basically what you're saying is that the analogy the person is making is not, it is a good one when you have to compare apples to apples. When you say you're comparing apples to oranges, you're saying that you can't draw the conclusion you want to draw because you're comparing two things that are dissimilar. And here's an example of a typical argument by analogy. You may have heard this before, you may not have, but here's one that I heard when I first started college. And it goes like this. Going to school is like having a full-time job. If you have a full-time job, you have to work 40 hours per week. Therefore, if you're a student, you should study 40 hours a week. And here's an argument, and what you're doing is you're comparing having a full-time job to being a student, and then on the basis of that comparison, you're drawing a conclusion. And when we make arguments by analogy, the question that we always are asking is the analogy, is the comparison a tight one? Yes or no? Are you drawing a tight comparison between the two things? And if it's not a tight comparison, then the argument loses its convincing power. If it's a very weak kind of comparison, this is why people say you're comparing apples to oranges. And basically when someone says, hey, you're comparing apples to oranges, they're saying the comparison you're making there is very, very weak, and therefore your conclusion is not justified. However, if it's a tight comparison, then we can say your argument is likely to be true, or your conclusion is likely to be true. Now the reality is that all analogies break down at a certain point. At a certain point, no analogy is going to be completely 100% similar. And in fact, if it were completely 100% similar, it wouldn't have any convincing power, because if the two things you're comparing were the exact same, you really wouldn't be adding anything new to the conversation. You'd just be repeating it, the same exact information, but just in slightly different language. So, for instance, I don't know if this is the exact best example of this, but years ago I had this job, and the job was working for a testing agency, and for the testing agency, hundreds of thousands of people took this test, and they had to fill out a Scantron. And the testing agency was very, very rigorous in making sure that every Scantron was graded fairly. They made sure that each one was actually placed by hand into a scanning machine. And one of them came up missing. So one of these Scantrons came up missing. And as a result, we had to scour through 100,000 Scantrons looking for just this one that we couldn't account for. And a lot of people were brought to our team and helping us sort through them. And everyone who was brought in, they kept saying, this is like looking for a needle in a haystack. This is like looking for a needle in a haystack. And after about the 6th or 7th time you heard this, you knew that the new person who was brought in, they were going to make the same joke. Now here we have a comparison. We're looking for this Scantron, right? And in this huge section of Scantrons, and it is comparable to like looking for a needle in a haystack. And by saying looking for a needle in a haystack, you're actually adding some kind of new information, I guess, in a way. You're drawing a comparison there that actually offers some kind of explanation or help you understand what's going on beyond just the obvious. So finally, one person came who was new to the group, and I could see they were about to say it. And so I went ahead before they could even speak, and I said, yeah, this is a lot like looking for a single sheet of paper in a large stack of papers. And everybody got a big laugh out of that, and one guy's like, yeah, it's exactly like that. Because all I was doing was stating the information that was kind of obvious. And the reason I'm saying this is because the analogy, there's really no analogy. I'm just restating what is obvious, what has been said. And this is why I was saying that all analogies, there's going to be a few differences. If you just restate the exact event or phenomenon or information and the same language or different language, then your analogy, yeah, it'll be perfectly airtight, but it won't offer any kind of new information. The analogy even between, what I was just describing, between needle in a haystack and looking for a sheet of paper within a large stack of papers, there's some differences there, right? There's some obvious differences there. I mean, paper is not haystack, a needle is not paper, but the analogy is strong enough that it offers some kind of insight or new information into what's going on. Like I said, all analogies are going to break down at a certain point, but you can think about it this way. A good argument by analogy, it'll get you to your destination before it does break down. So a good argument by analogy is like a car. At a certain point, all cars are going to break down. But the question is your car able to get you where you want to go before it does break down? And in fact, I just made an argument by analogy. I compared arguments to cars. And obviously, those things are dissimilar. But the point here is they were able to get me where I wanted to go, hopefully the analogy was, before it broke down. Now the question we have is, does Thomson make a strong analogy between the violinist and the pregnancy? Is she comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? Now there are going to be some obvious dissimilarities, but the question is, are the dissimilarities allowable, or are those dissimilarities so great that her analogy breaks down? And one dissimilarity between the violinist and pregnancy, and this is probably something that came to everybody's mind right away, and this is what almost everybody intuitively thinks, is just this. They say, well, look, in the case of the violinist, you were forced to be attached to the violinist. You were abducted in the middle of the night. However, in cases of sex, you consent to the pregnancy. In cases of sex, you consent to the pregnancy, whereas in the case of the violinist, you were forced. And this is probably the most obvious disanalogy that people raise against Thomson's violinist argument. And Thomson has a couple of replies to this, and this does seem like a pretty obvious kind of disanalogy to bring up. And one thing Thomson says about this is he says, look, well, at the very least, this doesn't apply in cases of rape. Because in cases of rape, you're forced to have sex, and as a result of that, if a pregnancy arises, again, you're forced to, get pregnant. It's not like you just say, hey, I want to get pregnant or I don't want to get pregnant. I mean, in a case of rape, there is this huge element of coercion, both with the rape itself and then also with the pregnancy. I mean, obviously, you don't get to choose that either. And so this, I think, is a really good response on her behalf, and it seems like a very obvious response, and it's a very important one. And you might not think so, because a lot of you may have just thought, well, look, if a woman wants to have an abortion, if she becomes pregnant through an act of rape, then she should be allowed. And like I had said, 70 to 80% of people think that this is a legitimate reason to have an abortion. That is, if a pregnancy results as a case of rape. But here's the thing that's really important, is even though that seems like an obvious position to hold, even though it seems obvious, it's not always clear what the justification or rationale is for that. Now, this is a case where I think a lot of people agree with the results, and because they agree with the results, they think that they're entitled to those. But just because you agree that this is a good justification doesn't mean that you have clear evidence to think it. And as I said a long time ago, we were discussing various positions, various conservative positions. Some of them are motivated to these strong positions due to the fact that they consider the fetus to be a person. And if the fetus is a person, they say, well, then you shouldn't be allowed to have an abortion, even if that abortion results as a case of rape. Why? Because basically you'd be punishing the innocent fetus for the crimes of someone else. And I think the response to this is not to say, which a lot of people say, and I'm sure some of you, when you write up your final exam answers to this, are going to say, is a lot of people say, well, yeah, but the woman endures a lot of pain and suffering as a result of rape, and it's not fair. And because even though that's true, that's not going to be the kind of thing that would convince someone who begins with the assumption that the fetus is a person. It's not going to convince them, because they're going to say, even though it's unfair for a woman to suffer, it's also unfair to kill a person as a result of that. So I don't think that's a good response to this strong conservative position. But what I do think is a good response is this violinist thought experiment. Because in that you can agree, say, yes, it is a person, the fetus is a person, but that doesn't give it a right to attach to the woman's body. Why? Because she was forced. And because she was forced to attach this fetus to her body, because she was forced, it's a matter of bodily rights at this point. It's not a matter of fairness. It's a matter of bodily rights. And the fetus, even though it's a person, does not have a right to attach. For the same exact reason that the violinist didn't have a right to attach. You cannot force someone else to allow you to attach to their body, whether it's the violinist or the fetus. And so this is the critical point here. It's the reason Thomson would argue, and I happen to agree with her, the reason that it would be permissible to have an abortion in cases of rape is not due to the fairness or unfairness or the pain and the burden that the mother would have to experience. Those are legitimate concerns, but the reason that would be justifiable is because it's a violation of her bodily rights. That's the issue. That's the response that I think a lot of people fail to realize. Someone like Paul Ryan, I don't think he fully understands or appreciates the force of this argument. They say, look, it's not that it's unfair that you can detach the violinist because it's unfair. You can detach the violinist because they don't have a right to be there. They cannot have a right to use your body unless you grant them that right. So I think that this is a really good response and a really good way of justifying abortion and where a woman becomes pregnant through cases of rape. Secondly, and Thomson makes another point here, because she really thinks that the violinist argument demonstrates a lot more, because what she wants to say is that the violinist argument doesn't merely demonstrate that abortion is permissible only in cases of rape. She thinks it's also permissible in other cases as well. In fact, she's going to say that abortion is permissible in pretty much most every case. And what she says here is she says just this. She says, here's a second response to this possible disanalogy. She says, in consensual voluntary intercourse, one consents to the sex, but one does not necessarily consent to the pregnancy. And so this is another way that Thomson responds to this challenge about consensual versus non-consensual sex. A lot of people try to draw a disanalogy here. A lot of people try to say, hey, look, Thomson, the difference between the violinist and the difference between that and pregnancy is that the woman consents to the pregnancy when she has sex, whereas the violinist, you don't consent. But what Thomson says here is that that's not true. What the woman when she engages in voluntary intercourse consents to is the sex. She doesn't consent, however, to the pregnancy. And it is especially true if a woman takes precautions not to get pregnant. If a woman takes precautions not to get pregnant, then you might say that she took all precautions, and that's a clear sign that she doesn't consent to the pregnancy. She doesn't want the pregnancy. Remember, when we're talking about consent here, what we're talking about is what you want to happen, what you agree to allow happen. Now you might say, but she knew it would come about. And that's fair enough. Yeah, she knew it would come about, but that doesn't change the fact that she didn't want it to come about. She was trying to avoid it. She was trying to prevent it. So yes, she consented to the sex, but she didn't consent to the pregnancy. Now I have to say, for my money, I find this response a lot less convincing than the response number one. Her claim that the analogy between the violinist and pregnancy holds in cases of rape, that seems to me to be somewhat plausible. But the second response, that you consent to the sex but not to the pregnancy, I mean, on a technical level, I think she's right. Yeah, you did consent to the sex, you didn't consent to the pregnancy. Especially that's true in cases where you practice safe sex. But my question for the second response she makes is, so what? Why does that matter? And I think the issue here becomes that your moral responsibility is not dictated because of what you consented to, but your moral responsibility is determined on the basis of what you knew would occur and what you caused. What you caused and what you knew would occur. So think of it like this. Suppose someone plans a bank robbery and they do everything to avoid getting caught. And then they get caught, and the police, they stop them, they catch them, and then the robber says, "Hey, wait! I consented to the burglary. I didn't consent to getting caught. Look, I took all the possible precautions to avoid getting caught. Therefore, I can't be blamed for this." I don't think that kind of response would fly for anyone. Why? Well, because you knew what you were doing and you caused it to occur. And those two facts alone are what determine your moral responsibility. So, again, like I've been saying, this second response to say, hey, you consent to the sex, you don't consent to the pregnancy, I mean, at a technical level, that's right. I mean, you don't consent. You're saying, I don't want this to happen. I'm trying to avoid this to happen. But my feeling about that is, so what? I mean, you caused it. You caused it with the full foreknowledge that it could occur. And so even if it's right that you didn't consent, the fact that you initiated this causal sequence freely and you knew what a possible outcome was, that's sufficient to place a certain moral responsibility and obligation on you. So what we've canvassed thus far is just this, is we've seen a possible disanalogy between the violinist and between pregnancy through sex, between the violinist and abortion. And Thomson has one response to this kind of complaint right here. So this point at the top here, this is a possible problem with the violinist thought experiment. And Thomson has one response here, which is just that, well, this doesn't hold in cases of rape, and that seems right. But then she also says that it doesn't hold generally because in consensual voluntary intercourse, one consents to the sex and one doesn't consent to the pregnancy. My response to number one, right down here at the bottom, I think Thomson's right about her first point. I'm skeptical about her second point. And the reason I'm skeptical about her second response is just because it seems that the issue of consent is a red herring. It's irrelevant. What's important is that you cause this certain outcome, or you initiate a causal sequence that led to it with the full foreknowledge that it could occur. So this turns to a second possible disanalogy, and this leads naturally into it, which is just to say this, is that in the case of the violinist, you didn't cause your predicament, all right? However, in the case of pregnancy through consensual sex, you do. And this is exactly the point I was just making a second ago. In the case of the violinist, I mean, you really bear very, very, I would say, depending on how you define causal responsibility, you either bear none or very, very minimal causal responsibility at all. However, in the case of pregnancy through consensual sex, you do bear huge amount of causal responsibility. I mean, you freely initiated this causal sequence. You're like, hey, yeah, I think you're cute. Let's get it on. Dim the lights a little bit, put the Van Dross on, light the candles, whatever. I mean, you initiated this causal sequence, or you took part in the initiation of your own free will of this causal sequence. So there is a disanalogy here in terms of causal responsibility. And the fact that you causally initiated this sequence of events which would lead to the pregnancy of your own free will, and you knew what could happen, you bear responsibility. And this is supposed to be the principal difference between the violinist and a case of abortion. In the violinist, you didn't initiate the causal sequence, you were forced. In a case of pregnancy, you do initiate pregnancy other than rape, you do initiate the causal sequence of your own knowledge and free will. And what Thomson wants to say about this is just this. Is she says, look, I don't think this is a good point, and here's why. She says, being partially responsible for the fetus doesn't give it a right to use the mother's body. And what she wants to say is just this, and I can put this in a different kind of way, is she wants to say that just because you're partially causally responsible for something, that in and of itself doesn't mean you're morally responsible. I mean, she says, heck, we can be partially causally responsible for a lot of things, but that doesn't necessarily place any kind of moral obligation on us. And it certainly doesn't necessarily, just because you're partially responsible for the fetus, doesn't give it a right to use the mother's body. Now, she gives a couple of examples in order to demonstrate this, and I want to be very clear because this always gets a little murky and a little confusing for students at this point, especially if it's your first time hearing it. I'll be honest, I read through this paper a number of times before these two distinctions became evident to me. The first possible disanalogy we were talking about was an issue of consent. What do you agree to? Right now, what we're focused on is not what you agree to, but what you cause to occur. And these two things a lot of times go hand in hand, because if you cause something, then there is some element of consent there. But not everything that you cause do you always find consent. Like I said, think about the bank robbery I was talking about a second ago. You don't consent to getting caught. You're trying to avoid getting caught. But you do cause it, right? You did cause it to occur, and you knew what could occur. You didn't want it to occur, so in that sense of consent, yeah, you were trying to avoid it. You didn't agree, but you did cause it. So we've kind of shifted away, well, not kind of, we've shifted away from the first disanalogy, which was all about what you agree to. And now we're talking about, well, not what you agreed to, but what did you cause to occur. It's like, and here's another one. Even sometimes by accident, like if let's say I'm playing when I was a little kid, I would throw a baseball up in my backyard and I would hit it, right? And I was like, well, let me try to avoid hitting it into my neighbor's window, so I'm going to face away from my neighbor's house. But then let's suppose I hit, I shanked the ball and it went through my neighbor's window. Well, I was trying to avoid hitting it through my neighbor's window. I didn't want that to happen. But nonetheless, I caused it, and I knew that it was possible, and so I'd be responsible for it. This is what we're focused on now. And like I said, the concern that's raised here for Thomson is that, okay, let's just give her this like, here's what somebody's saying to Thomson. It's like, look, I'm just going to grant you that you didn't want the pregnancy. You tried to avoid the pregnancy, but nonetheless, you caused it. And you caused it knowing what could happen, and therefore you're responsible. And what Thomson's trying to say is, look, just because you cause something that you know can happen doesn't mean it gives it a right to be there. It doesn't mean it gives the fetus a right to be there. And so she gives a couple of examples to illustrate the point she's trying to make, which is that causality doesn't give somebody a right to be there, or doesn't give somebody a right to attach to your body. And she gives this example of a burglar. And what she says is just this. She says, suppose it's like a cool summer evening and you decide to open the window to your house. And you open the window to your house to let in some of that cool air. And as a result of opening the window to your house, there's someone who's a burglar who's out on the prowl. And the burglar is basically targeting any houses that look like an easy mark. He sees that your window is open, and so the burglar climbs in through the window. And then suppose when the burglar climbs in, you see him and you say, hey, get out of my house. You yell at the burglar. And the burglar says, whoa, 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 back up a minute. It's like, look, you knew that there were burglars out on the prowl. And you know that burglars like to burgle. And so, I know that word burgle is silly, isn't it? But it's a real word. But you knew that burglars were on the prowl, and you knew that burglars like to burgle. And had you not opened your window, I would never have come in your house. So you're partially responsible for me being here. Had you not opened your window, I wouldn't have come in. And since you're partially responsible for opening the window, you're responsible for opening the window and you're partially responsible for me being here, I have a right to be in your house. So you have no right to tell me to leave at this point. And so what Thomson says is this illustrates that just because you're partially to blame for something doesn't give someone else a right to enter your house. And to this, I'd say she's right to a certain extent. I mean, yeah, you are partially responsible for them being there. They don't have a right to be in your house. But nonetheless, this doesn't seem at all comparable to a case of pregnancy. Because in this case, with the burglar, basically, the burglar is a free, autonomous being who can make competent, rational choices. Whereas the fetus isn't, right? The fetus isn't at all. So I would agree with Thomson's burglar example, but the comparison here, the analogy to pregnancy, strikes me as a fairly weak one. And she recognizes this. She recognizes this isn't an airtight, this isn't a very strong analogy. This seems like comparing the burglar to comparing to a fetus seems like apples and oranges. Because the burglar is an adult with intentions and agency, the fetus isn't. All right? And so even though you might say you bear some causal responsibility because you created a situation where the burglar could more easily burgle, at the end of the day, the burglar is the one who chose to be there, and the burglar is the one who acted on that. Whereas the fetus doesn't deliberately form intentions and act. They're just not at the stage in their development where they can do that. So this analogy really breaks down. But she gives this analogy, she says it's kind of a warm-up. And the warm-up is to get to this other analogy, which is the people seeds analogy. Now, I have to go ahead and warn you, this is really, really weird, and I'm always slightly embarrassed to discuss this analogy just for the reason that it's so bizarre. So just bear with me. I didn't create this. I don't know what she was on when she came up with this. But anyways, here's her people seeds analogy. And she says, imagine it's like this. Suppose there are these things called people seeds, and they exist and they float and flutter about in the atmosphere. And she says, suppose that they'll flit and flutter, and what they'll do is they can come in through the windows of your house, and they can get down in your carpet. And once they get down in your carpet, they take hold, and they can plant, and they can take root, and then they'll grow into people. And she says, suppose that you don't want them to do this. You don't want to be responsible for them at all. You're like, no, I don't want to have people seeds growing in my house, and I don't want to be responsible for them. So what you do is you decide to put up screens over your windows. You put chemicals around your screens in order to, if any of them come in contact with the screen, it'll kill them instantly. Maybe you put up an extra door, a screen door to your house, a storm door, so to speak. Maybe even you build a foyer with another door in front of it to block them from coming in. So you take all these precautions. And yet, as it turns out, one of the people seeds, there's a tear in a screen in your window, and it gets through, and it gets down in your carpet. And once it does, it takes root, and it begins to grow. Now the question here is, if the people seed does this, if it gets through a small tear in your screen, does it have a right to be there? Does the people seed have a right to be there? Or is it within your rights to tear it up and take it out? Are you morally obligated to nurture it and grow it at that point? And I think when people hear this thought experiment, they're inclined to think, no, you have a right to remove the people seed. You have a right to remove it. And so here's the point that Thomson wants to make with the people seeds. It's like, look, you're partially responsible. Oh, I got a typo here. You're partially responsible for the people seeds. Why? Well, she says, look, you could have boarded up your windows. You could have never left your house. But that doesn't seem reasonable at all. So there is an extent to which you're partially responsible for them being there. You do bear some partial responsibility. However, they don't have a right to implant in your house. Just because you're partially responsible doesn't give them a right to be there. And so what Thomson says is likewise with the fetus. After all, you could have had a hysterectomy. You could have removed your organs, entirely. You could have never engaged in sexual intercourse. You could have done all of these things. So even if you become pregnant, you always are going to bear some kind of responsibility. Heck, even if you become pregnant through an act of rape, you bear some responsibility because, like I just said, you could have had a hysterectomy to have avoided ever becoming pregnant whatsoever. But just because you could have done these things, and just because there is this level of causal responsibility, it doesn't make you morally responsible. It doesn't give the fetus a right to be there just because there is this level of causal responsibility taking place there. And so for that reason, just because you're partially responsible, it doesn't give the fetus a right to be there. And so what Thomson says here is this second disanalogy doesn't hold. She says that, again, the disanalogy was with the violinist, you're not causally responsible, whereas with the fetus, especially through voluntary consensual sex, you are. And you can see here the analogy she's pushing with the people seeds would be a case of protected sex, right? The screens on the windows represent condoms, the chemicals to kill them, that's like, some kind of, spermicidal gel or lube or something like that. You can see where she's going. It's kind of obvious. And so she's trying once again here to draw a parallel between the fetus and the people seeds. And so really and truly, this example of the people seeds, what it's designed to do is to kind of shore up some elements that weren't completely addressed with her violinist example. And so here's what Thomson says, as we've been discussing. Now, the question I have is, does this people seeds analogy really hold? Or are there any kinds of differences between the people seeds and consensual sex? I mean, that after all is what the people seeds example is really supposed to be showing here, is that at the end of the day, that it's supposed to be an analogy for consensual protected sex. The violinist seems to work in cases of pregnancy that occurred through acts of rape. That's where the violinist example really seems to hold. But Thomson wants to create a stronger argument and say, even if the fetus is a person and one engages in consensual sex, one should be allowed to have an abortion. And she uses this people seeds analogy to demonstrate that. But I have some serious questions about the people seeds analogy. And the big question I have here is it really comparable to a case of voluntary consensual sex? Now, a lot of people initially find that it is, but here's my question. Where did the people seeds come from? Where did they come from? And Thomson doesn't tell you. She doesn't tell you at all. And that's a huge problem because things I think are going to change drastically depending on your level of causal input into the people seeds existence. So imagine, let me just make this a little clearer. Imagine, for instance, that the people seeds are of no threat to you. There is this magical land, the land of people seeds, right? And you live in a different area where the people seeds don't exist. And you decide, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to move to the land of people seeds because I like them so much. I think they're pretty and it's nice to view them. So you do that, all right? Well, now you've taken deliberate causal steps to put yourself in harm's way, and you know what can happen, and you've initiated this causal sequence to lead to that potential effect. Now that's very, very different than if you live in a world where everywhere you go, there are just people seeds, and the people seeds just come at you like an unstoppable rebel force, all right? In the first case that I described, you're initiating a causal sequence that leads to a potential or possible outcome. In the second case, you're being forced, your hand is being forced, and there's nothing you can do to stop that. And this is important. Why? Because if the scenario is like the first one I described, where you move to the land of people seeds, I know some of you are thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I'm taking this class right now. What the hell are we talking about? But sorry, this is really weird, I confess. But in the first case, you are initiating this causal sequence, and that seems very, very similar to consensual sex, where pregnancy arises through consensual sex. You initiate it, you cause it, you know what can happen. The second one, however, if you live and the entire world is just, covered with people seeds and you can't escape them, well, that seems much more like rape, or pregnancy through rape. Why? Because you're being forced into this. And so here is the question that I raised for Thomson, and why I find the people seeds analogy just to be inconclusive, is because how we morally assess this, or how we assess this just in general, is going to determine on why the people seeds are threatening you at all. If it's a result of your voluntary agency, well then I don't know. To me, it's like if you cause them to be there, then maybe they very well do have a right to implant. At the very least, someone who's strongly conservative pro-life is going to say, yeah, they do. And so I don't think this argument would appeal to them. On the other hand, if the reason the people seeds are there is through no voluntary act of your own, you're just forced, well then this analogy really doesn't advance the conversation any more than the violinist one did. Because once again, it's going to seem comparable only to pregnancy through cases of rape. So this is the problem I have with it. If either this analogy doesn't advance the conversation because it's just parallel to the violinist, it's just another illustration of you being forced to get pregnant, which is what it would amount to, or you freely choose to get pregnant, or you freely choose to act, which leads to pregnancy, which again seems to take us right back to where we were, that you caused it, you knew it, and therefore you're responsible. So I just don't personally find this analogy very persuasive. And for whatever it's worth, most people who read Thomson's article, not just me, but not just students, but professional philosophers have said the same. They've said the violinist one seems to hold in cases where a woman becomes pregnant through acts of rape. It seems pretty parallel there. But where a woman becomes pregnant through consensual sex, voluntary sex, it seems less likely to hold. And the people seeds analogy doesn't do much to help her out either. So I want to give a quick summary. We're not quite out of the woods yet. I want to just give a quick summary. Actually, I just did that. But here's what we have gone so far. We've seen Thomson's violinist analogy. We've seen that it appears parallel where a woman becomes pregnant through an act of rape. And so it would give us a strong reason why abortion would be permissible in those cases. As I said, it's not about the burden or unfairness to the mother. It's really about bodily rights. And the fact that if a woman becomes pregnant through an act of rape, the fetus doesn't have a right to be there any more than the violinist had a right to be attached to your body. The people seeds analogy was used really to show that a woman could have, the reason Thomson used it was to show that a woman could have an abortion even in cases of voluntary consensual sex. But there's some serious questions about the people seeds analogy. There's some serious questions about that, primarily because either it's just once again a case that's parallel to the violinist, and so it doesn't advance us beyond that, or it's a case where you knowingly, freely allow the people seeds to threaten you, in which it doesn't seem that it's going to appeal to someone who is conservative and strongly pro-life. So what we have is that the violinist, what we've concluded thus far, I've tried to conclude, and you might disagree, is that the violinist analogy seems to work, but only in cases of rape. But here we find that there are some questions even for this, and I'm going to talk about two possible ones. And a lot of people have argued that the violinist analogy doesn't work even here. Even in cases of rape, the violinist analogy breaks down. And I want to look at a couple of these and see what people have said. And one thing we're going to point out here is that an example or complaint that's brought up by Francis Beckwith. This was another article out of Signs, and what Francis Beckwith says is just this. He says that by using the story of the violinist as a paradigm for all relationships, thus implying that moral obligations must be voluntarily accepted to have moral force, Thomson mistakenly infers that all true moral obligations to one's offspring are voluntary. And so what Beckwith is complaining here, and this is a kind of a different sort of example or complaint I should say, is that he says just this. He says, look, by relying on Thomson's violinist example, basically what she's implying is that a parent only has obligations to their children if they voluntarily accept them. But what he says is just this. He says, look, we have all kinds of moral obligations that we don't voluntarily accept. And especially a parent has all kinds of moral obligations to their children that they don't voluntarily accept. So he uses a couple of examples to illustrate this. And one thing you might say here is something like an unwilling father. For instance, imagine a woman gets pregnant, a man helps get a woman pregnant, they voluntarily consent to the sex, yada, yada, yada. A question might arise is, does the father have any kind of moral obligation to that child to help raise that child or provide financial aid despite the fact that he may not want the child? And the majority of people here say, yeah, it's like, look, you got her pregnant, you need to help out. You need to help raise the child. You need to help at the very least, support financially. But notice here, he doesn't want it, but yet he has an obligation. So he has an obligation that he doesn't voluntarily accept. And so this is what Beckwith says. He says, look, you have an obligation, but you don't voluntarily accept it. And so this is a reason that the violinist example, according to Beckwith, doesn't really pan out, because it implies that all moral obligations we have to our children have to be voluntarily accepted. Here's another example. Suppose someone leaves a child at your doorstep. Let's say you're in a cabin out in the woods. You're snowed in for the winter. You're not going to be able to leave for several months. You hear a knock at the door. And then you just look down and you see a little baby there, and it says, please take care of me. And then you see someone's footsteps have run off into the woods. Do you think it would be morally appropriate just to shut the door in their face and let the baby freeze? Chances are no. Most of us would say take that child in. Especially if you have the resources. Let's say you have plenty of resources to care for them. Then you should take that child in. But notice here, you don't even have a biological relationship with this baby. But nonetheless, you have a moral obligation. So you didn't voluntarily accept it, and yet you have a moral obligation. And so what Beckwith is trying to argue here, he's trying to argue that there are many obligations we have, and we have those even though we're forced to accept them. We don't have to always voluntarily consent in order to have a moral obligation to someone. Now, what do you think Thomson would say in response to this? What I think she would say, and I actually think she has a very good response. In fact, the reason I mentioned Beckwith's complaint is because I think it's a very confused complaint that Beckwith raises. I think Beckwith's complaint is good because it demonstrates a confusion that a lot of people have. And I think what Thomson is going to say is, yeah, you're right. You'd have a responsibility to raise your child if you got a woman pregnant. Yes, if a baby is left at your doorstep, you have to take care of it. You have that responsibility. I think Thomson's going to agree with everything that Beckwith has complained about, but she's going to say, what's the point? Why is that relevant? That's not what I'm saying at all. She will easily agree that we have many moral obligations that we don't voluntarily accept. But what she's going to say, and this is what is fundamentally different, she's going to say that that's very, very different to have a moral obligation than to say that someone has a right to use your body. So let me illustrate the point here with the example that I have listed up here. Suppose that you're driving and you're in a car accident, and let's say you like slip off the road. You're texting, you're being negligent, and you accidentally run off the road and you crush somebody's leg. Let's say from the knee down, and it has to be amputated. Now you didn't do this on purpose, right? But you have a moral obligation to make some kind of financial compensation to them. You have to financially compensate them. Maybe you will even have to serve some time in jail. And I think we would agree with that, depending on the level of your negligence, right? Well, they have a right to your money, but something that they don't have a right to, they couldn't say, you crushed my leg, now give me yours, right? They couldn't do that. They couldn't demand that your leg be amputated from the knee down and that it be attached to their body. And maybe some of you might feel that way, but I think most of us say, no, they don't have a right to your body. And this is the key point for Thomson. Because she's going to say there's a difference between someone having a right to your property, time, energy, this sort of thing, and someone having a right to use your body. So go back to the examples that Beckwith gave, right? He said, like, someone leaves a child at your doorstep. Thomson's going to say, yeah, you have to take them in. You have to take care of them. But if there was a note on the child that said, I need your liver, give it to me, well, then no, they don't have a right to your liver. They don't have a right to your body. They might have a right to your property, but not to your body. And this is something that's really important because we recognize that we have property rights, but property rights are less stringent than bodily rights. Your bodily rights are very, very strong rights. People have to give up their property rights. If you get arrested for something, you might have to give up your property rights. But the government can't demand, and I think we all recognize it would be barbaric to cut off someone's hands for theft. We might, make them pay a penalty for it, but to cut off their hands, that would be, or, if someone lies under oath, right? They might have to pay a penalty for that. But it would be wrong, I think we would recognize, to cut out their tongue or something like that. Bodily rights are very strong rights. Property rights can be more easily trumped. It would take a lot more to trump a bodily right. And so the point here I'm making is that Beckwith's complaint misses. And it misses because he fails to recognize that Thomson's whole argument rests on this idea that someone can't have a claim over your body without your consent. Someone can't have a complaint, or without your causal input, I could say also. Someone can't have a claim over your body. They might, a parent, might have all kinds of obligations to their children, but those don't necessarily always involve bodily claims. They would involve, obligations of property or obligations of time and energy or these sorts of things, but not bodily claims. So, Beckwith's complaint, I think, really misses the mark. Another kind of possible disanalogy that people bring up is just this, is that they'll say, and this will be the final one we discuss, is that they say, well, a big difference between the violinist and between a case of abortion is that it's a difference of stranger versus offspring. What people will sometimes say is that here's the difference, is that the violinist is just a stranger, this person plucked at random from out in Nowheresville, whereas your child, that's your child, it's the fruit of your loin, it's a biological connection here, they're your offspring. And so while it's permissible to detach the violinist, it's not permissible to have an abortion because there's a special bond, a special obligation, in virtue of the fact that they're your child. And what Thomson says to this is just, she questions it. What she wants to say is like, why think that? Why think that you have a special obligation to a child at all? What would generate this kind of special obligation? Is it just sheer biological relatedness? Well, it can't be that. It can't just be that just because you're biologically related, that means that you have a special obligation. I mean, think about egg donors or sperm donors. Do they have a special obligation to the children that are produced from their eggs or their sperm? Surely not, but there's a biological relatedness there. So what produces this kind of special obligation? What produces this at all? And what she says is that you only have a special obligation if you've assumed it. And furthermore, I can add to it, and this kind of piggybacks on the point I was making from the previous objection, is that even if you assume that there's a special obligation here, does that special obligation give the child a right to the parent's body? I mean, think about this for a second. My mom brought me into this world, and as a result of bringing me into this world, she does have certain obligations, or did when I was a child, to me. She had an obligation to feed me, to clothe me, to shelter me, right? And these are things that I reasonably as a child had a right to. But did I have a right to my mom's organs? Like if, let's say my kidney was shutting down, could I go to her and say, hey, Mom, you owe me this. I have a right to your organs. Now, I think my mom loving me, the fact that she loved me, she would have probably given a kidney to me. But it's very different between saying that what she would do and saying what she had, what I had a right to. That I could say, you owe me this, give it, right? You're violating my rights if you don't give it. That's a very different kind of thing altogether. And so here's, I think, another part of the response that Thomson would make is just to say that even if there's a special obligation between parent and child, that doesn't necessarily generate a kind of claim over, or doesn't generate a legitimate claim from the child to the parent over the parent's body. That special obligation doesn't grant the child a right to the parent's body. All right, so I actually had another complaint listed on the PowerPoint, and you can read over it if you want. There's a lot of discussion that's been had over the years of Thomson's thought experiment, the Violinist and the People Seeds. Actually, there have been books and books written on this. It's a very interesting thought experiment, and it's so interesting because you can see it raises a lot of questions about moral obligations, consent, causality. These kinds of issues, they come to a head with her thought experiment. And you might even have still some reservations of your own as far as Thomson's thought experiment goes. But hopefully, so far, you can see some of these issues and how they work. Like I said, for me, what's so fascinating about Thomson's argument is the fact that what she tries to do is show that abortion can be permissible even if the fetus is a person. And that's such an interesting claim to me. Furthermore, I think it does successfully show that abortion can be permissible in cases of rape. And that might seem like a small victory since you agreed with the result. But just because you agree with the result doesn't mean you're entitled to it. And as I said, people who are pro-life, if they're being consistent, they're not going to be swayed by, well, it's a burden to the mother, therefore it would be permissible to have an abortion in cases of rape. Because they're going to say, just because it's a burden to the mother, it's unfair, it grieves her, that doesn't give you a right to kill. But this argument, it does provide a sufficient justification, or a much more plausible one, because it doesn't have to reject any of their starting assumptions. It can agree with all of their starting assumptions that the fetus is a person, but yet it can still provide us a justification for why abortion would be permissible in a case of rape. If Thomson's, or whether or not Thomson's argument demonstrates anything more than that, that's where things start to get really murky and really contentious. And I'll leave it for you to decide. But hopefully you can see so far how this issue of abortion is much more complex than you might have initially thought. I find that people, as I said when I was first introducing it, a lot of times they begin with positions and they don't really sway their opinions anymore. To me, abortion is one of the most complicated issues out there. And I think that this is demonstrated by the fact that it's been around for thousands of years. People have been disputing it for thousands of years. There's so much that can be said about it, so much more that can be said about it. But hopefully I've kind of put you on the track of maybe thinking about it in more subtle ways or more complex ways than you had in the past.